is so insane.
All right, welcome everybody to another installment. We will be interviewing and reviewing the debate to get today with between William Lane Craig and Mohammed Hijab, and my good friend Dr. Beau Branson joins me today. And of course, Dr. Beau is very pertinent, very adjacent to this conversation because he's published in the book that William Lane Craig mentioned in the debate about 4 views on Trinity. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So it's William Lane Craig, me, Bill Hasker, who he mentioned during the debate, and Dale Tuggy.
And that's 4 views on the Trinity, and particularly issues that are relevant to this debate, such as inseparable operations, and we'll kind of get into that later on. But before we get into it, Dr. Beau, what's your overall feeling and assessment of the debate before we get into the particulars?
So I was pretty disappointed by it. I was actually really looking forward to it because, on the one hand, William Lane Craig is this like legendary debater, super smart and everything. But I think that the doctrine of the Trinity is literally his the weakest thing, that maybe his Christology. But anyway, it's something he's really weak on. So it's kind of like, wow, I mean, this would be really interesting to see, is Mohammed Hijab going to beat him? Is this going to be really, interesting? But yeah, so I guess for me, I mean, I just spent a bunch of time on this book that we're in. So I've kind of, recently been thinking through his whole model, and there's like a million things that I want to say about it. And it was really frustrating in the book too, is it's like you just kind of have a limited word count, for every chapter. So I think I had written like 2 or 3 times the word count and still had stuff that was just in outline form. And I was like, well, I got to cut down everything. So I was thinking gosh, there's so much stuff that you could go through. And Mohammed Hijab stuck the landing on any of the arguments. Like he kind of mentioned different topics that could go into like a larger debate, or a larger argument for the incoherence of his view or something like that. But he never really connected a lot of those things. Like the first, I don't know how much it was, like quarter of the debate or something, where he was just talking about how William Lane Craig's view is heretical or whatever. And it's like, well, cool, but how does that show that the doctrine of the Trinity in general is incoherent?
Right.
Plain,
which was the title of the debate, was the coherence of the Trinity.
Right.
Before we get into that, and this is an area that you focus on, you're really good in, could you tell us a little bit? I know that a lot of the audience does not know the academic literature and the sort of schools and theories. Could you tell us a little bit about what's the difference between what they're calling the debate, the Latin model of the Trinity, and then social Trinitarianism, which William Lane Craig espouses, and then we'll kind of counter that with the Orthodox view that you defend, which is monarchical Trinitarianism.
So we'll start with social Trinitarianism, maybe. So what they call social Trinitarianism, basically all social Trinitarians seem to be really focused on this idea that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are 3 distinct centers of consciousness and will and whatever. So kind of 3 minds. That seems to be sort of definitive of social Trinitarianism. And then originally, you read older stuff on social Trinitarianism was kind of like, well, then they form this like society, and God is really like the society. It's like, God Incorporated or something. It's like the whole, they form this bigger thing. And there's been all sorts of different kind of variations on it since then, though, because that's kind of just maybe that view is a little unsatisfying in various ways.
What's the origin of that view, by the way? Who's kind of the first to propose that? Somebody pretty modern, right?
Actually, this is a book I'm supposed to write a review for, and I'm way late on. But this is a Protestant guy, Matthew Barrett. it's a decent introduction, I'd say, to like Western sort of Trinitarian thought. Like he does a pretty good job of that. And he goes in the first part and really goes through a lot of kind of the history of social Trinitarianism, and basically came up with kind of to make the doctrine of the Trinity relevant, because it just wasn't like in Western theology anymore. So, thought, well, maybe if we make God into a society, then we can just sort of map stuff from the Trinity onto social things. And so he goes through all these things about, how the Trinity has been used to, support like environmentalism and gay rights and feminism and, socialism, like just all kinds of different things. But it definitely is in the I think the 50s maybe is when it first started really kind of coming out. So not super old. And to say that the persons of the Trinity kind of form a larger whole is partialism. I mean, at least on a straightforward reading of it, and that's been rejected as a heresy for centuries.
Right.
So what they call the Latin model, I mean, basically, it's really that's kind of a term for really more like what people in maybe a few decades ago sort of thought that was going on in most Latin, like scholastic theology or something like that. People used to have this view that there was a huge divide between like Greek and Latin thought on the Trinity. I think Michel Rene Barnes and people like that have pretty much destroyed that kind of caricature. But anyway, that was the idea, was like, well, the Latins kind of start with the one and then move to the three, and the Greeks kind of start with the three, so they're more clear about the distinction of the persons. But in any case, I guess the basic way to put what people usually mean by the Latin view is just that God is this one substance, so one simple thing, and somehow, I mean, if you're talking about like Aquinas, the persons are subsistent relations, whatever exactly that means. And the worry, of course, that everyone has is, well, Latin Trinitarianism sounds like it's really just modalism, and social Trinitarianism, or Greek as they used to understand it, sounds like tritheism. And so what's the, how do you avoid both of those is kind of, but I think that's not a very accurate.
Well, but you would agree, though, that by the time in the Middle Ages, as this is sort of a side issue, but I know what people, for example, people that are big proponents of the Western right will hear you say that there's not a big difference and think, oh, well, see, he's saying that there's no difference between Palamas and Aquinas and everybody's teaching the same thing. You don't believe that, do you? Or that's not what you mean by?
Well, no, I guess I would just say, I think the more the further I go along, the more I think maybe a lot of people are just being misunderstood. So like Augustine in particular, I find a lot of times maybe we're just misinterpreting him. Like if you kind of read him through a scholastic lens, then he looks one way, but if you read him in the context of, the other church fathers at the time, he might be closer, really, to the Cappadocians. But
I'm speaking more of the Middle Ages, though, like with Palamite synods and the way that they treat the Thomistic.
If we're talking about like Aquinas, I mean, I do think like Aquinas's fascination with divine simplicity is a problem, and I think that's kind of a criticism a lot of modern philosophers would raise too, which I don't think is.
Well, part of the reason I bring that up is that I remember years back I was listening to William Lane Craig, and he had a brief debate that was only on audio with Bishop Barron, and Barron was defending the Thomistic position, and I noticed that somehow or somewhere along the way, William Lane Craig apparently had got wind of modal collapse arguments, and he sort of brought in this critique of Thomism on the basis of modal collapse, but he doesn't seem to have the toolkit of the essence-energy distinction to really sort of make sense of it. So a lot of what he talks about in these discussions, to me, seems to be that he's lacking precisely that toolkit, which is, in my view, also connected to the Apollinarian position that he has, because for him, person is really equated to like a human, like an individual over there. A person is just an individual with a body and a soul, and so that's why it's the Apollinarian error, because if he says Christ is the logos is replacing the human soul or the human mind in the humanity of Christ. That's a confusion of nature and person on the level of humans. And so I think that there's this nature person mistake, and then there's this essence entity, the thing that's missing in the William Lane Craig scheme.
Yeah, no, I agree. I actually, in this book, I find Craig very unclear at times. It's very strange because, I mean, he's an analytic philosopher, and he's, generally speaking, very clear, very precise, and I find it hard to kind of parse. And also, I guess he's changed his views, so I criticize a bunch of stuff, and then he's like, "Oh, I don't believe that anymore." But yeah, one of the things that by the end of it, I pointed out is like, yeah, the way that he understands being and person, or person and nature is sort of reversed. So what he calls I put it this way: what he calls tripersonal monotheism, I say, is what Gregory of Nyssa would probably call tritheistic modalism.
Yeah.
It's really, when he talks about, so his view is kind of, God is like this one soul, this one immaterial soul that has three sets of so he really has one hypostasis that has three different powers, which we would kind of one-to-one associate a particular power with a particular instance of a nature. So he really does ultimately have one person with three natures. I mean, that's kind of how or three energies explicitly, he'd say that. So it's just kind of the opposite of what it, is supposed to be. But anyway, that's kind of his view, for better or worse, which I think there's a million things you can criticize about that. And I was hoping that Mohammed Hijab would, find something, but it's just like he kind of focused on a handful of things. Could have gone a lot deeper on a lot of issues, but anyway, I guess we'll talk about that.
So getting into the debate, he opens up what William Lane Craig does by he didn't really plan the 5 minutes or however long they had, because maybe it's 4 minutes or something like that, because he kind of like was saying stuff and then the time ran out. But he did the sort of pitch on the basis of the Kalam argument, which was intended to appeal to, I think, to the Islamic audience, which most Muslims don't really care about Kalam and medieval philosophical disputes. And that's really why I think in this debate, Mohammed Hijab, who doesn't know these topics, was relying totally on Jake, by his own admission, for a lot of this.
That the whole time, I think he Mohammed Hijab put out some video just afterwards that was, he just explicitly said that. I was like, oh, that's kind of what it sounded like.
Yeah, there was a funny mistake he made where he seemed to think that the law of identity is the same thing as the is of predication, and that's why it's the is of identification law, which those are not the same things. But that was an attempt to sort of trick William Lane Craig with some version of the logical problem of the Trinity and the predicating of, if the Father's God, the Son's God, the Spirit's God, then the Father is the Son, based on identical predication. But we've dealt with that. You've covered that in terms of the debate that I did with Jake as well. But before we get to that, he appeals to the Kalam cosmological argument. I don't think it's a very good apologetic argument. William Lane Craig believes that he's revived this and sort of made it relevant again. But the first mistake that I saw, and feel free to agree, disagree with my take on it, was he began his argument for the Trinity by saying first that it's a New Testament doctrine. I think it's very important that we understand that it's not only a New Testament doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that kind of came up. I mean, we didn't, unfortunately, really get into that in any detail in the book, but it will be obvious to you or any Orthodox person like that we're just coming at this from completely different angles. One thing that really irked me, and I just didn't have time, I didn't have word count, to actually address it, was he mentions a few times, like in the Gospel of John, when John says Isaiah saw his glory. But the way that Craig always describes it, he's like, oh, look, John is I think he says retroactively doing so, or retrojecting Christ like back into the Old Testament, in this appearance of Yahweh or whatever. And I'm like, no, that's not what John's saying at all. Like he's saying
Isaiah's son. Yeah, exactly.
Christ sitting on the throne. Like that's the idea. Because I go into in my chapters, I talk about the theophanies, as like one of the things that your
right.
view about the Trinity needs to address, because historically that was this like one of the major, things that was kind of driving the doctrine was, how do we make sense? And it's very clear just if you read late
Justin versus Trypho, for example.
Yeah, like early Christian stuff, and also late Second Temple Jewish literature, and then look at the New Testament. I mean, I go in and kind of mention some of that and compare. Anyway, I go through sort of the probability of it all, but point being, like, it's very clear that the New Testament authors themselves were looking at the Old Testament and saying, how do you make sense out of the theophanies, and sort of saying, well, Christ is the God that appeared to Moses and Jacob and so on. And Craig is just kind of like, oh, well, they're, sort of reading him back into it.
But I mean, Jesus himself, John 5-9, in the debates with the Pharisees, identifies himself as the one talking to Moses, as the one eating with Abraham. So,
Yeah. And he just doesn't, I mean, he just, he thinks that the Old Testament theophanies, I guess, were God the Father, and that it's just sort of reading Jesus back into. But for Craig, that's kind of all, that's his view, right? It's just like, oh, we look at the New Testament authors are indicating that Jesus is divine, and that's kind of, that's all he cares to.
Well, but I mean, again, maybe you don't agree with this, but this is a key point, I think, against kind of the natural theology presuppositions that William Lane Craig appealed to multiple times to say, hey, we believe in monotheism just like you Muslims. He said this multiple times in the debate. And, when you look at the Vatican II documents, when they talk about the purpose of natural theology, it's explicitly in Lumen Gentium 16 and Nostra Aetate 3, it's explicitly to find this common ground that we're all worshiping the God of Abraham. The Muslims have the faith of Abraham like we do. Vatican II says that twice. But of course, according to Paul, the faith of Abraham is the faith in the angel of Yahweh. It's not a faith in a Unitarian deity, and this is very important for this discussion. So I think that from an apologetic standpoint, that's a weak position to take if you're taking the Christian position against the Muslim, to say, oh, well, we all believe in monotheism, but it's not the same monotheism. So anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it's an important point, because it's like, you can say something like, we all agree that the total count of gods equals one, or something like that.
Yeah, right.
But it's like, if you're worshiping a different God, like, no one would be okay if someone was just like, well, I worship Baal and Baal alone, so I've got one God. I'm a monotheist. Just like you, like, no one would be happy with that, right? And it does put things in a very different light when you point out, like, no, the God that gave the Torah to Moses was Jesus.
Yes.
Like, well, that puts things in a very different light when you're claiming to worship this God, but also, it's sort of like this scene where someone's like talking about how cool Spider-Man is, and then Peter Parker's there, and they're like making fun of him. It's like, well, you're sort of, maybe you realize the inconsistency and the irony of it, but you're doing something that's kind of out of place there, right? And that gets lost when you just sort of say, well, we're all monotheists. So.
Next issue that I think is tied into the one about the New Testament only being the basis for where he supposedly wants to prove the Trinity. He says, I don't know where he would get this. My guess would be the Protestant idea of the perspicuity of Scripture, this idea that, well, the text just says what it means, and it means what it says. This is a common refrain from Protestants and sola scripturists. He says that there is no metaphysics, there's no baggage, there's no hair splitting. The New Testament doctrine of the Trinity is really only two basic tenets, that there's one God and three persons. But I don't know, where in the New Testament alone is that the two basic tenets? I think he's assuming the Protestant presuppositions here, that there is this lowest common denominator that we can scale it down in the New Testament. And then you said there is nothing in the New Testament about inter-Trinitarian relationships in life, which I thought was an odd statement.
Yeah, we get into that in the book a little bit too. 'Cause, he wrote a paper about the eternal generation. It's something like is Christ generated or begotten in his divine nature? So he has this view. It's just, well, call him the Son because he was incarnate and something like that. And he goes through and just kind of, he just sort of tries to argue that the Bible doesn't sort of explicitly make that clear or whatever, but he doesn't really, at least as far as I can tell in anything he's written, he doesn't really have any like positive reason to reject eternal generation, except for this thing about aseity. He just thinks like, well, if you have the divine nature, you have to be ase, which I think, I've called that the
yeah, that was the Jake argument that you guys had.
Yeah. And I kind of gave a little argument against that in the book, and also I just pointed out, this also comes down to a question: what is the Bible? Because the Septuagint says, "From the womb before the morning star, I have begotten thee." Right, and that's I don't know, something else. I think it's some jumbled mess in the Masoretic text that does, like, no one knows what it just looks like. The text is corrupted or something. But anyway, I'm like, well, what's, is the Septuagint not the Bible? It's my Bible. So kind of,
right.
And there's also, I think, warrant for it in the New Testament. You just kind of have to dig a little bit deeper, but yeah, one thing that's frustrating too to me is he talks about what he calls the biblical doctrine of the Trinity, and that's what he calls it in this book. But you would think that a phrase like the biblical doctrine of the Trinity would just mean like whatever the Bible says about the Trinity, right? Whatever that ends up being. But of course, if that's what it meant, then like Dale Tuggy, who's a Unitarian, would claim that he believes in the biblical, like what the Bible says.
Well, I think everybody, every person says they're.
What's the content of that, right? Like everyone will claim to believe it, but he like just stipulatively defines like, okay, by biblical doctrine of the Trinity, I mean, boom, 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 and it's like, okay, but that's not necessarily like, I don't know that that's all and only what the Bible says about the Trinity.
Right.
Like there's more. So it's kind of a textbook example of persuasive definition. Like he's just trying to kind of pack a premise into and pretend like that's the definition of it. But
and also
I was going to say, I don't have any problem with sort of defining Trinitarianism in sort of a broad sense of the term as like one God in three persons. But it might not be Orthodox Trinitarianism. It might be, I argue like, when we really talk about the doctrine of the Trinity, we really mean what the church settled on in the 4th century. And so that's just, in my view, that's just what the term refers to. So, I just kind of say by the end of the book, like if you're going to just deliberately reject the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity, like what's in the creeds and the church fathers, like just say, I reject the doctrine of the Trinity. Like I reject what English speakers are referring to when they talk about the doctrine of the Trinity because, I don't think it's in the Bible.
Well, even the church fathers would complain that every heretic, whether it's Eunomius or whether it's Nestorius, would say, well, I believe in the doctrine of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and my doctrine is biblical. Yeah, but what does it mean is, of course, the key question here. So a lot of word games, a lot of ambiguity, textual and referential ambiguity. Now, the next thing I noticed was that, and this might be a little more controversial, but he says there's no metaphysics involved in the doctrine of the Trinity. I'm not sure that that's the case, even in the New Testament. You have in Hebrews 1 the statement that the Son is the direct image of the Father's hypostasis. There's some kind of, meaning to that that's more than just what the text says. This is, again, a very common Protestant argument that texts just mean what they say what they mean. And when he was asked about this, well, why do you have this position? And he says, well, I believe in sola scriptura. So, I thought there was going to be more of a highfalutin, fancy reason why maybe we get into aseity, like you're saying, but it just ended up being, well, I just follow the New Testament, and this is what the New Testament says. But again, what about these other verses where philosophical, quote-unquote, terminology is used, like hypostasis?
Yeah, and I mean, scholars have tracked down so many passages where Paul and other people use terminology from Platonism, from Stoicism, and so forth. So it's even in the New Testament, people are drawing on the resources of Greek philosophical thought, to make their points. So, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I think people want theology to be sort of metaphysics free somehow,
right?
Sort of feel like it should be or something. But yeah, I don't know that really works. What was it I was just thinking of too? Well, anyway, I'll think of it later.
But like Greek terminology in the New Testament.
What were you saying just before that you're...
the text means what it says. The texts aren't theory laden. They're just kind of, surface.
Yeah. One thing I think, here's what I was thinking of. He does this in the book. The book was disappointing, I thought, in some sense. His first chapter was a little disappointing. He is 90% of his first chapter just going through New Testament evidence for the divinity of Jesus, or evidence of, I guess, the divinity of Jesus in the New Testament, right? So he tries to make the case that the New Testament authors think Jesus is divine, and that's literally 90% of the chapter, and then he just has a page and a half or something at the end where he's okay, and here's my model of the Trinity. Here's how I think this works, and he's just yeah, God is an immaterial, tripersonal being. Boom, no metaphysics, no nothing. Bam, out. And I just laid out here are kind of the arguments against the doctrine of the Trinity, the biggest ones in the literature. And you want a model to kind of be able to answer those, and you also, here's the theophany issue. That's kind of an argument for the Trinity, and you want your model to be consistent with what originally was one of the major impetuses, if that's a word, for the Trinity. So and I just get look, you're you haven't answered either of these big questions. I mean, the obvious question is the doctrine of the Trinity tritheistic? Is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is that three gods? And just telling me there is one God, but there are three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, each of whom can properly be called God, and properly means literally, not just metaphorically or whatever. That just creates the question. I mean, that's what the big question is how do you, if you can call each one of these God, then how is that not three gods? You have to, that's the question. And he doesn't do anything to answer that question. I mean, he just kind of acts like it's just, there's no problem. But it's no, you haven't addressed the question at all.
One question I have, because I've only read, I read Reasonable Faith, and I read his book, Defending Genesis. So that's really the only William Lane Craig books I've read over the years. I thought the Genesis book was actually pretty good, but does he ever interact with the Cappadocian models and approaches that you specialize and talk about in?
Yeah, a few times, but very lightly, I would say. And in a way that's frustratingly selective also. So he has a paper where he was criticizing Mike Ray's model of the Trinity, and he kind of draws on one of Basil's epistles and kind of says, it looks like maybe Basil is talking about this kind of view and rejecting it. But then, of course, if you point out that there are church fathers that are rejecting his views, just oh, well, I'm a Protestant. I bring everything before the bar of Scripture.
Yeah, right.
Blah, blah, blah. Oh, why? Yeah, it's just kind of odd. So, yeah, I mean, he kind of just vaguely, he talks about how the Cappadocians were clear that there's a distinction between the persons. Yeah, and sometimes he kind of mentions them, but it doesn't really make much use.
Now, that book is you had sent me, I think, an advanced version of that. I've got to read some of that. Is that out yet, or is it still not out yet?
No, I don't really know what's going on with it. It's still at the publishers. We all sent in our final drafts in like January 1st, like everything was in. So it's been there since then. And every now and then I get an email from the editor and it's like, oh, they're trying to figure out, is this a typo or whatever. And so I'm not really sure what's delayed it, but.
And one more time, the title is Four Views on the Trinity, and it's what publisher?
Well, One God, Three Persons, Four Views.
Okay, gotcha.
I think it's Whip and Stock. Chad McIntosh will be the editor. So we'll see. When it comes out, I'll certainly
come back and we'll get a deeper interview on that. Now, moving on, the next section is Mohammed Hijab giving his opening statement. William Lane Craig did end his opening statement with it, which a good question, which is, Tawheed is not a unified position in Islam. Of course, we brought this up a lot in the Muslim debates. I brought it up to Muslim Lantern not too long ago, which is a fair question. And then, of course, they will say, well, and Mohammed Hijab said this is tu quoque. I'm not sure it is tu quoque because doing an internal critique isn't tu quoque. And I think in a debate, it's a fair question to ask. Okay, I have a burden of proof if we're going to debate the Trinity, but I don't think it's unfair to ask. You have the same kind of issue of reconciling the one and the many in God as well. It's not persons, but for you, it's the attributes of Allah, the dependence relationship of the attributes. So I think that's a fair question, but Mohammed Hijab tried to sidestep it by saying, well, we don't disagree that there's one Allah, but we just disagree on what that means. Well, that's the point. So just saying that you all believe in one Allah is another word game, really.
We say, we agree that there's one God. We disagree about, what all that requires.
And that led to deaths, actually. This wasn't just a minor dispute. There were just, in the early Islamic stages, they were killing each other over this. So it's not some minor dispute.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought about that, too. Is when he said, like, that's a tu quoque, I was kind of like, well, like, on the one hand, it doesn't show that the doctrine of the Trinity is coherent. But I think there is a point to saying, like, you're offering this argument against the Trinity, but you yourself don't believe one of the premises.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Because if you did, it would cause this other problem for your own view. So it seems a little disingenuous, right? So I think it was legitimate. I mean, maybe it wasn't immediately obvious to Mohammed Hijab, like how it was relevant or something, but I thought, it's relevant if like your own worldview can't sustain that or whatever. So,
and I think that the next question that Hijab asked, which he brought up, which I think this was a fair question, and I think we would agree with this, which is that William Lane Craig does not represent historic or mainstream Christianity, and so
the one that's where I was like, I wish that Mohammed Hijab would have just explained, like, what exactly is the conclusion that you were aiming at with that. Because it's like, I'm listening to it and I'm like, I wish that William Lane Craig would not be a Trinitarian heretic. That'd be awesome. And I agree, he shouldn't be. But and it's sort of like vaguely embarrassing, like, you've got, this kind of minority and basically heretical view. But it's like, okay, but then where are you going with that?
Well, the conclusion he tried to draw was a non sequitur. The conclusion was, because William Lane Craig's Trinitarian doctrine is outside of the norm, outside of the mainstream, that the Trinity is not a clear, conspicuous doctrine, and Christians disagree. Well, of course, but that wouldn't disprove the Trinity. So,
I think that's part of what Craig is trying to do with this really broad definition of just like one God, three persons. That's the Trinity, is kind of like, well, then anything that falls under that umbrella like counts as a
which
version.
is interesting because Mohammed Hijab wanted a very broad umbrella for Muslims all believe God is one.
Yeah.
So if there was a fair standards here, he should have granted, I think, this broad definition, even though I don't agree with that broad definition, but still, from a debate perspective, it shows, I think, a double standard.
The weird thing too about that is, if you're going to say, okay, William Lane Craig's view doesn't really represent like historically the mainstream Orthodox view about the Trinity, then what that really does is that means you could demolish Craig's view and you haven't really addressed, like,
The
the
Trinity.
actual,
Yeah.
Orthodox view. So it was sort of like he just thought, well, if William Lane Craig like grants that the standard view is incoherent or something, then like we've proved
exactly.
at the very end of the debate too. I mean, he even sort of he said this. He was just like, well, William Lane Craig and I have demolished the traditional Orthodox view or whatever. And his own view also has problems. It's like, you didn't demolish it. You just both agreed to not talk about it and just sort of agreed to stipulate that.
Well, this has to do, I think, also with Mohammed Hijab intentionally choosing William Lane Craig as his opponent, because it allows him to say, I'm debating the most, quote, eminent of the Christian apologists that are out there. Once I've done this, I don't really have to deal with anyone else, because he's sort of the figurehead of it. But he's not really the figurehead if by all of the argumentation Hijab is making, he's the fringe outlier. So he's not. So, but I think it was an intentional choice to debate William Lane Craig and to explicitly not choose to debate me and Sam, or me or Sam, or me and Sam and him and Jake, which he doesn't seem to want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, right after that debate, Capturing Christianity did a review like a few hours later or whatever. And David Wood made some interesting observations about it. So one was that he thought like maybe he was going to just try to, from now on, be like, well, I've already debated William Lane Craig. I don't need to, I don't have to debate anybody anymore, which is probably, that sounds plausible. But also he made an interesting point about who he thought the intended audience was. And he thought that, this maybe wasn't really directed towards like trying to convince Christians that the doctrine of the Trinity is incoherent and they should become Muslims, or trying to convince people who are kind of on the fence or agnostic or whatever, but just trying to, but that he's really just kind of trying to keep Muslims from...
No, it's their audience. In fact, I think the last several Muslim debates were really just done for Muslim audiences. Yeah, to find a kind of like, well, clip that little 30-second there and make it look like Jay didn't know what he was saying or Sam didn't. No, that's exactly it. Yeah. And to that first point, actually, Mohammed Hijab today said that very thing. He said, I've debated William Lane Craig. I don't have to debate anybody else.
Yeah.
He said that on Twitter today. So yeah, I think that David Wood was correct there. But again, I want to issue the challenge again to Mohammed Hijab. I did talk to Myron today, and Myron said that Fresh and Fit would host me and Sam Shamoon versus Mohammed Hijab and Jake, because Mohammed Hijab was saying that Sam has to debate Jake first, then he would debate Mohammed Hijab.
Yeah.
And then Sam's idea was, well, why don't we just do a 2 versus 2? So that should solve everybody's complaints if we want to do that. But anyway, getting back to the debate. So it seemed like he was trying to sneak in a little bit of that logical problem of the Trinity there, because he said, if Father is God, Son is God, Spirit is God, therefore Father is Spirit, because all are God. This all relies on just sort of one usage or reference to the word God, as if God couldn't pick out different things, which again I think comes from Jake. Thank you. And we've covered that, and I think you helped pointing to a lot of the literature and various papers that deal with different ways of counting. Anything you wanted to say, because they didn't really go into logical problem of the Trinity, just kind of mentioned in passing.
Hey, I mean, I took a bunch of notes, and then I was just thinking about that today. I was like, did I miss something, or did he just never really?
It never came back out.
The claim that this is 3 gods, which is kind of surprising. Like, seems like that's the first thing a Muslim would want to do, would be say this is tritheism. I kind of thought about that. I'm like, if they just decided that that's kind of played out, or
but to your point, where this debate goes when it gets to inseparable operations, I mean, unless I misunderstood, you're saying that the model, that this inverted Nissa model that William Lane Craig has, it actually kind of does lead to tritheism, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And in fact, one thing that comes up. So see, this is one of the things that was kind of disappointing. I guess maybe Mohammed Hijab, aka Jake, would not have any way to know all this. But anyway, it kind of comes out in the book that Craig has this, just is completely inconsistent about what he thinks about counting and such. So when I talk a little bit about, how in antiquity people would think that counting works by you're counting discrete, separate things, not overlapping things or anything. So when I talk about that, he's like, "That's crazy. That's nuts. The only way you can count is by identity." And he, cites this paper. I think it was by Hughes or something. But anyway, he is just like, "Oh, this is crazy. This is just nuts." But then he says, because I talk about inseparable operations, and that the persons of the Trinity have the same will and they're, all this. So he says, well, that's really just one person then. That's really Unitarianism. But notice that if you want to say that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are not identical, but they are just one person, then you're saying that we don't count by identity. We don't count persons by identity. So, in fact, the paper that he cites, like one of the main arguments in there about, let's forget about this weird, relative identity and counting and all this stuff. One of the premises in that paper is like, if there are n number of Fs and all the Fs are Gs, then there have to be at least as many Gs as there are Fs. So it's like, well, if the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three anything, then by that reasoning, if they're all persons, there have to be at least three persons. Funny is he adopts like Gregory of Nyssa's view basically for counting persons,
yeah,
but not like beings or whatever. And I just point out that, well, but what Craig calls a person is what Gregory of Nyssa calls a God. Like a divine person is what he's calling God. And what Craig calls a being is a hypostasis. So really, so I was like, really, there's not actually any philosophical disagreement here. It's just a terminological thing. Like what Craig calls divine persons is what Gregory calls gods. And Craig admits that Gregory has just one of those. He just calls them persons instead of gods, right? So he's basically admitting that Gregory of Nyssa has just one God if they have inseparable operations, which is the whole argument that I was making, is like inseparable operations are key to, defending the view that there's one God.
Right.
So he's just kind of incoherent about that, and that was something that Mohammed Hijab never really got into.
Right.
Another thing he does that's really weird is he says that to me, like you have to count by identity, anything else is incoherent and crazy. But then when Craig is responding to Dale Tuggy, he says that people in antiquity didn't even have a concept of numerical identity like we understand it today, where, so you can't make these arguments about identity that Tuggy was making. And I actually asked him, we were in a roundtable discussion sort of thing in November at this Evangelical Philosophical Society and Theological Society. We got a chance to kind of ask each other questions. And I asked him, I was like, so, you say that this is how counting has to work, but people in antiquity didn't even have the concept of identity that they would need in order to be able to count. So I was like, so how were people in the ancient world able to count? And he was just kind of like, oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, literally, that was his response. Just like, I was like, okay. Well,
maybe he could bite the bullet and say that they just didn't even count. There was no counting in the ancient world.
People were just like, oh, how many donkeys is that?
So what Hijab, and that's good because a lot of people don't know this area of critique when it comes to the terminology confusion there. What do you think is the source of William Lane Craig's terminological confusion? Is it just lack of familiarity with the patristic ideas of nature, person, and all this kind of stuff? Or is he just sort of maybe obtuse about it because he's committed to his definitions? Or is it because he doesn't really care what the church fathers say because it's a biblical perspective? I mean, it seems like, it's just odd to not want to use the terminology that the church fathers sort of adopted.
Yeah, to be fair, I mean, I think that a lot of confusion has been generated by social Trinitarians.
Okay.
And I don't, I mean, maybe some of that deliberately, maybe some of it not. So, he may just, if you don't really dig into it, maybe you would just sort of think, well, this is kind of, in fact, I mean, Hasker even sort of made this point that he was just like, surely you know about all of this, debate about what a person is and whatever. And I was kind of like, I know that debate is just a dumb debate that we, like, that's really not that hard. But yeah, I mean, social Trinitarians are so like, social Trinitarianism doesn't work if you have, I mean, unless you have distinct minds and wills and whatever. It's not social Trinitarianism anymore. Also, though, I think Craig, I forgot when he did his doctorate in theology, I forget who, but he might have studied under, I know he studied under Pannenberg, but he might have studied under someone else there too that was like one of the big like early proponents of social Trinitarianism.
Oh, okay.
His education but so I don't know, but that's
that's an interesting point. I didn't know that. Now the next section, William Lane Craig responds by saying, well, you have Quran, or no, this is Hijab responding to. I thought this was a really weak response. William Lane Craig said, in Quran 5:16, you have this reference to a misunderstanding of the Trinity. And Mohammed Hijab's response was pretty preposterous. It was like, the Trinity is not mentioned in that verse. Well, but the verse is about the relationship of Christ to the triad and whether he's divine or not, whether Allah has sons or not. So the debate was not about whether the word Trinity is used, but is this a reference to Trinitarian doctrines, namely the deity of the Son, which is a Trinitarian doctrine. So by extension. So I thought that was a really weak response and sort of trying to sidestep the fact that clearly, and this is a very powerful argument if you think about it, because remember, if the Quran is true, if Islam is true, we would at least expect them to get the basic doctrines of Christianity correct. Even if they think it's false, it should at least have some basic presentation of, well, these errant, people of the book believe that, there's three persons in one essence or something, but it never even states that correctly. In fact, I have Ibn Taymiyyah's book over there. Even Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't state what the doctrine of the Trinity is correctly. So that shows that the early generations of Muslims, namely Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, very important to Jake and Mohammed Hijab and the Athari Muslim school there, like even Ibn Taymiyyah repeats this misunderstanding, showing that the Quran actually does misunderstand the Trinity.
Yeah, I'm not qualified to say a whole ton about the Quran, but yeah, I was kind of, it'd be nice to have more detail. Like, it was just kind of like, well, yeah, that's not really what it means. It's like, well, I mean, I thought that passage was sort of about the Trinity, like that. So, I mean, if we're talking about the Trinity in general, then anyway, another thing with that, I mean, I don't know that Islam is committed to something like the clarity of Scripture the way Protestants are, but
they are. At least the traditional ones are.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, then it's kind of like, well, then you'd expect the Quran to be more clear. Like,
well, in fact, the Quran says in multiple places that the Quran makes all things perfectly clear, and then nothing is unclear. Although there is another verse which says some verses only Allah knows the meaning. So I'm not sure how everything is clear, but then there's other verses that say that only Allah knows the meaning of them. But anyway, that's a good one to bring up. Now, William Lane Craig responds by saying, well, look, there's two broad schools of Trinity. There's social and there's Latin. Well, that's not true. But if you're in a modern, I guess, analytic Protestant setting, you would only think that. I'm surprised he didn't mention any other models. He didn't mention the monarchical Trinitarian model.
Yeah, it was kind of... I get maybe he just feels like he doesn't understand it or something like that. And he mentioned Hasker and this does, I don't know, I kind of go back and forth on this. So in this book, Bill Hasker and William Lane Craig, I mean, they're both social Trinitarians, and according to them, they basically agree about everything except the eternal begetting, right? So Hasker thinks that the eternal processions are really important to kind of secure monotheism. although when I talk about the monarchy of the Father, which is basically the same thing, and saying how that's important for monotheism, he seems to like want to resist it in weird ways that I don't really think he needs to. But and then Craig just thinks no, they have to all be absolutely say whatever. So, and I'm not really sure if they don't actually disagree more really under the surface, but they kind of present it that way. So I mean, that was kind of his I guess response to Hijab. There was kind of like, well, if you want to talk about how the fact that he rejects eternal begetting, then just look at Bill Hasker's model, and it's basically the same thing. But just and Craig, I mean, he is clear that his model of the Trinity is supposed to be like neutral with respect to that question. So he's kind of like he personally rejects eternal begetting and procession of the Spirit. So, but he's like, but if you want to believe in the eternal begetting of the Son and eternal procession of the Spirit, have at it.
Well, to that point, this was something that I thought Mohammed Hijab could have hammered harder, which he didn't really. He kind of touched, sort of in passing, mentioned it. But if social Trinitarianism is what William Lane Craig affirms, and his affirmation of that, as he says by his own admission, was because of sola scriptura and the New Testament texts, why was it that no one was a social Trinitarian until the 1950s, if this was the clear New Testament teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was Martin Luther and Pastor Bob from the 100s.
Was Martin Luther? I mean, does he count? Martin Luther wasn't.
No, I'm just people who like hid, the guy who like hid the King James Bible.
Oh yeah.
He later discovered.
And then Joseph Smith found it. Joseph Smith found it and prayed over it.
Then like I don't know, Moltmann or someone who I don't know. Who knows? I mean, maybe it's not until William Lane Craig that we really figured out the doctrine of the Trinity.
Exactly. Now, Hijab said something I thought was odd, where he says, and William Lane Craig returns to that point of there being many schools fighting over Tawhid, and Hijab again says, yeah, but we all believe God's one, which is, again, a deflection from the actual criticism. And then Hijab counters by saying, and I guess he got this from Jake, because I've never heard anybody say this, I've never heard this. You could please correct us if this is false. I would assume it's false. He thinks that the Cappadocians teach a social Trinitarianism. That's just simply not true. And is there somebody who argues this? Where would this come from?
Who said that? Craig or
Muhammad? Hijab in passing said, do you think that the Cappadocians teach social Trinitarianism? He said something like that, affirming that the Cappadocians teach a social Trinitarianism.
Yeah. Well, so a lot of social Trinitarians. Oh, sorry.
I think Hijab isn't familiar with these terms because he's sort of just repeating what Jake's told him, and so he was probably just assuming that this is some sort of ancient model, and that's why William Craig has it, because he wanted to then say that if you believe the Cappadocian social Trinitarianism, why do you reject eternal generation?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, so a lot of social Trinitarians have appealed to the Cappadocians.
Okay, I see.
Support for their model. So especially early, like in the 80s and stuff, you'll have people pointing to Gregory of Nyssa in particular.
Okay, that's where they're getting that then.
And the reason is because I think it's just that the way at least people understood like Latin Trinitarianism or kind of traditional Western view was kind of tantamount to modalism, if it wasn't just kind of a, kind of repackaged modalism or something. But and it's just that the Cappadocians are very clear about the distinction of the persons, and they accept that they'll sort of run with the three-man analogy, like they're kind of, that they're not going to say they're three gods. I mean, it's not totally analogous, but they'll kind of run with that for a while. And so it's kind of clear that, okay, there's a distinction. And so social Trinitarians would say like, look, that's this Greek tradition, and we need to kind of recover that. And it's their, these kind of early social Trinitarians or something. And I think, once you get into the details of it, they're not social Trinitarians, but a lot of social Trinitarians, especially early on, kind of appealed to them.
Next, William Lane Craig moves on. That was where he makes his statement that there is no New Testament teaching about the inner life of the Trinity. I thought that was odd.
Yeah.
And then there's an argument from silence, which I thought was also not a very good argument, which William Lane Craig says, well, I don't believe in, I assume he's talking about eternal generation there. I don't believe in eternal generation because it's not taught by the post-apostolic fathers. Well, that's an argument from silence. I mean, yeah, it might be the case that they don't mention it, but there's all kinds of things that the New Testament first century post-apostolic fathers don't talk about or teach that William Lane Craig also holds to. For example, the New Testament post-apostolic, or the post-apostolic church fathers don't list the canon of Scripture that William Lane Craig has, and so why would we think then that it has to be an explicitly written affirmation to believe that this was something taught in the post-apostolic period? So a lot of Protestants do this. They'll have this sort of arbitrary standard of, well, I don't have to accept something like eternal generation of the Son because it's not mentioned until whatever late person they think it's mentioned by. But that's really, again, I don't think that's a very good reason to. I mean, there's all kinds of things the post-apostolic fathers don't talk about that Protestants believe.
Yeah, and I mean the canon of Scripture is kind of the big like gotcha because it seems obviously circular and self-referentially incoherent but yeah, there's a million other things, and this is another thing that's really frustrating is William Lane Craig also has this book where he's basically he's defending like nominalism. Because he doesn't want to say that there's like, he doesn't want to be a Platonist and say like there's all of these Platonic forms or divine ideas or whatever that are also eternally existent, and that God's like dependent on them for his properties or something like that. In that book, he has a list of like early church fathers talking about how God is the only thing that is ungenerated and say basically. So it's kind of like, well, in that book, he's going to appeal to these church fathers.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
That God's the only thing that's say or whatever. So it's authoritative. There, or it's like anyway, it's really, you really should follow that. It's at least has some kind of oomph to it, right? But it's like, yeah, as soon as the church fathers go against you, it's well, I'm a Protestant. Yeah.
Right, and on that same point too, that's odd that he would defend a kind of nominalist position. Maybe he's just changed his position, because I remember a talk maybe 6-7 years ago that I listened to where he was defending divine conceptualism, and it was appealing to Platonism and Platonic arguments, which if you're a nominalist, that wouldn't work anymore.
Well,
so.
I think, in that book, I mean, he says that when he sort of started that research project out, he anticipated that he would end up being a conceptualist, but kind of as he went through everything more, he eventually decided he would be. So he might have been a divine conceptualist or something earlier on.
Okay.
But now he's like
now he changed. Okay.
Yeah.
Next, it begins to shift into. Now, this is the part where let's see somewhere. William Lane Craig thinks that. There's not a specific reference for eternal generation in the New Testament, and that the New Testament just simply teaches a very scaled down 3 persons, 1 God, and that eternal generation. William Lane Craig didn't explicitly reply to this, but the accusation of Hijab is that William Lane Craig thinks that eternal generation necessitates subordinationism. Is that what Craig argues somewhere?
Yeah, now that off the top of my head, I'm not sure if he...
Does he just think it's not a New Testament doctrine, or does he think that it mightn't necessarily?
I think his main worry is with aseity. He thinks that to be fully divine, you have to be absolutely aseity.
Okay, so is that why Jake got that argument? He just cribbed it probably from William Lane Craig.
Probably. Yeah. Craig and Ryan Mullins also makes the same argument. And Bill Hasker and Ryan Mullins have gone back and forth, like in various papers, sort of back and forth about whether aseity is required for divinity or whatever. But Craig definitely that's that's I think his probably main motivation. I can't recall off the top of my head if he talks about subordinationism in some other respect, but aseity certainly is the big issue for him.
Yeah, and this was the point where Mohammed Hijab says that if there's clear and ordinary language that teaches the Trinity, then why do you reject the traditional Christian teaching? Which wasn't worded well, but I think that's a fair question to ask William Lane Craig.
So how would that argument go? Like, just that it should be clear in the New Testament?
Well, William Lane Craig, as a Protestant, is arguing, well, look, I'm just arguing the clear, scaled-down New Testament doctrine of the Trinity. And then Mohammed Hijab is saying, but your social Trinitarianism is against the, 2,000-year clear tradition of what most Christians accept as orthodoxy. So it's more of a hermeneutical objection about clear and ordinary language. But I think Hijab is trying to score points with just demonstrating that, look, the Trinity is not coherent because supposedly it's not clear, but that's actually a false equivalence, right? Something can be true and not necessarily simple. And so a lot of Muslims confuse simplicity with clarity or perspicuity, and those are not necessarily the same things. In fact, when I debated with Daniel and Ijaz, the first thing Daniel said was, look, Islam's true because it's simple. God's one. Yeah. I was like, well, but that doesn't mean that it's true, because there's like a version of Occam's razor fallacy.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that really, it's like a huge pet peeve of mine, because I teach a class on like kind of critical thinking, sort of little bit of logic, little bit of just various sort of, and that's like one of the big things that we talk about is like for people who don't know, like this is something that's gotten a lot of attention just like from psychologists doing like empirical research about how people reason and the accuracy of their reasoning and whatever. And I mean, basically the consensus is like there's kind of two different systems going on in your brain at the same time. So there's what they'll sometimes just call system one. It's this like kind of intuitive, like fast kind of gut reaction, knee-jerk sort of reaction. And then system two is this like methodical, conscious, deliberate, going through, following rules and whatever. And the big issue is just like the system one, like what intuitively seems simple and obvious to us, like that system it's very quick and accurate in certain contexts, and then it just gives you the completely wrong answer in certain
others. Yeah,
and there's no way to know ahead of time, like whether it's going to be the accurate one or not. Like it's just sort of like it gives you the right results 99% of the time in cases where it kind of is important or to make snap judgments or whatever. But so it's like, it's one of the, like, this is something I try to spend a whole semester like telling students to not do this. Like just because something seems intuitively obvious to you has not necessarily like any relation to whether it is true or even coherent.
Yes. This is a key point, too, because I've had a lot of discussions with Thomists lately and with Muslims, and I've noticed a parallel between the discussion with certain Thomists and with Muslims. And the pattern is that both seem to assume that, well, look, everybody knows what monotheism is and what divine simplicity is, and that a self-evident, simple being has to be this, 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 and this. And that being would also be perfect. And we all know that perfection includes this, 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 and this. So it's like all this metaphysical baggage that, well, wait a minute, how do I know that's the right content for what you mean by one God? It's just all assumed. We don't know that that's the case. And then if you start asking them epistemic questions, it's like, well, but we all know that. So it's like basically just built on appeals to, like, appeal to masses fallacy or appeal to simplicity or something like that. None of which necessarily tells us that that's the case or how we're supposed to interpret what it means to be one God. It's just assumed. But that brings us to the next point where William Lane Craig says, well, the whole debate then shifts about halfway through to Mohammed Hijab saying, well, you believe in three wills in God. This necessitates conflict. Now, I think this was a silly way to go about the debate, because there's not necessarily anything about multiple wills that necessitates opposition.
So
He should have gone the route of what you say, of saying that, well, look, will has to be some kind of property of an existing nature or being, and that would necessitate three gods. But he doesn't go in that direction. He tries to argue that somehow having three wills necessitates partition in what the beings do, and it necessitates some form of opposition as a potentiality, which not necessarily, I don't think.
he referenced Scott Williams' paper. So Scott's a good friend of mine, and I don't know, maybe Mohammed Hijab didn't do a good job like articulating the argument, but what Scott's argument is if you have three wills, like social Trinitarians want, I mean, it seems like if you don't say anything else, then it seems like at least there are possible worlds where these three wills disagree. And you need to say something about like why there wouldn't be, right? Because you can, it's fine to say like the persons of the Trinity don't disagree and they always cooperate, but it seems weird to say they would, and they would get into a war.
Right. But this is where William Lane Craig appeals to this metaphysics of perfection, which I thought was odd because it's very similar to the Muslim appeal to perfection, which shows the presuppositions of metaphysical baggage that people have. Because, for example, a Muslim thinks that, well, to be the more perfect being means, in some cases, that Allah is only strictly just one. Because to have real multiplicity would mean some kind of diminution or some kind of imperfection. Because we all know that multiplicity means a perfect unity. Or, excuse me, perfection truly means a perfect unity without distinction. So that's a metaphysical assumption about perfection. But in other cases, right, Ibn Taymiyyah says, well, we all know that to be a more perfect being, Allah has to laugh versus not laughing, because laughing is more perfect than not laughing. So there's this weird metaphysical assumption about perfection. William Lane Craig then says, well, look, there are three perfect beings, so I can appeal to perfection of the beings, and therefore they would never be out of accord in terms of three different wills. I just thought the whole course of the debate at this point gets into to bad arguments here.
Yeah, it's so Richard Swinburne has this kind of view that although Swinburne believes in the processions too, so he kind of has a natural way for the Father to kind of have some, I don't know, priority in some sense. But anyway, one way social Trinitarians will respond to this argument is to say, well, they're perfect. So if they're all omniscient and they all are omnibenevolent, like they all know what's good and they all want what's good, so they'll all kind of so number one, they'll all just naturally want the good anyway. And then they know it's not good to fight and whatever, so they would all want to agree and whatever. Hijab brought up a kind of good point, but you can go a little further with it. So he just pointed out that God, there are some things that God wills that are, he didn't really put it in terms like morally neutral, but I think that's the idea. Like they're morally neutral and they're contingent. So just something like, suppose there's a possible world where the Father wants the sky to be blue, but the Son thinks it'd be better if it was green, and the Holy Spirit sort of likes red, and they can't agree on the colors, and they all have three different things, so they're all kind of voting on different things. They can't do it, by democratically or something. And Swinburne's argument is kind of like, well, they would all, as perfect and good beings, they would all like want to resolve that disagreement peacefully, and they'd be willing to kind of defer to the Father or something like that. But one thing that they didn't get into in this debate, and I've heard people give talks about this, and it's kind of overlooked sometimes. I like this phrase. Sometimes people call it a Canadian standoff, as opposed to like the Mexican standoff where who's going to shoot first. But the Canadian standoff, quote unquote, is like, suppose you're at the door and one person's like, "Oh, you go first." Oh no.
Yeah, it would never happen, right? It would be an eternal standoff.
Yeah, so it's like you can be perfectly like of goodwill, and you don't want to get in a fight, and and that's not necessarily enough to resolve the decision problem, like just having goodwill, because you can, in some cases, goodwill can lead to the standoff, right? That can't be resolved. Like if one person would just be like, yeah, okay, man, I'll go through, then that would resolve the issue. But yeah, it could be just precisely, maybe the Father wants red, the Son wants green, the Holy Spirit wants blue, but then everyone's like, oh, well, then we can just do what you want. Oh, no, we can do what you want to do. Oh, no, well, let's do what he wants to do. Oh, well, I want to do just whatever you guys want to do, So I think it is a problem that, like, if you're going to say there's three distinct wills, it's just not clear how it could be not possible for them to, like, disagree and not be able to resolve that disagreement. And maybe, I mean, I guess you could just say, like, well, luckily it turned out that they didn't disagree or something, but that's kind of a disappointing, like, unsatisfying, response.
Well, the next part, William Lane Craig says that modal collapse sort of makes an appearance, and William Lane Craig says, yeah, well, God does have, I believe, contingent properties. Which is odd language and terminology. Of course, I think he means the essence energy distinction and how we believe that God has different possibilities of what he can will to create or not to create, or that God does different actions. But that's odd. Yeah, odd terminology. Is that maybe I've never heard contingent properties. Anyway.
Yeah, I would just take that as he probably is just thinking of proper.
Well, he says the power of creating, like to create, is not something that he had to do.
Yeah, the property of creating, being a thing that has created. I mean, usually, like, philosophers today will just use the word property in a very broad, just cover it's true about something. So I think that's how he's using that.
And then it gets into an issue, but what I'm saying is that, again, because there's not an essence energy distinction there, even though William Lane Craig seems to be aware of the modal collapse issue, rather than using and going to Orthodox theology, which resolves this question, it's just another situation where, I've got to invent sort of my own, system or baggage or whatever. I mean, it's the New Testament and the Old Testament, I think, as Dr. Bradshaw has shown in multiple papers, that teaches the essence energy distinction. I mean, it's a biblical doctrine, so if you want to be biblical, well, Paul's teaching the, essence energy distinction in multiple passages in the New Testament where he talks about the energeia working in him to work with Christ and so forth, the power of God in him. Dunamis, etc. That's all New Testament. But why wouldn't we use that if we want to resolve this issue of this specific point? I mean, and Palamas does this. He says, if you want to notice the difference between essence and energy, he says, look to God creating and then ceasing from creating. That is an example of this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think he have that apparatus, right? So it's just kind of like, well, I don't know. God has some necessary properties and some contingent properties.
Yeah.
But one thing that's, this is another thing where I get kind of confused. I mean, it's hard for me to understand what his view actually is, because if you're going to be a nominalist, I mean, I guess maybe he would just say, maybe we just have to translate all of this talk about properties into talk about predicates that are true about God or something. Because, I mean, there's not really any properties if you're a nominalist.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Which also, this is another thing that Mohammed Hijab never brought up, which I wish that he had. So number one, I mean, even if you are a realist, it's kind of I always have this question, like, you've got this one soul that has three sets of cognitive faculties. Like, what exactly individuates the cognitive faculties? Like, how do you get three of them? It's not the subject, because there's only one subject, only one soul. So that's not making them three. They're not, like, in three different places spatially or something, because it's God. And you reject eternal relations of generation and procession. So there's no, like, asymmetric relations to individuates. It's like, how exactly do you get?
Yeah, what individuates? What would he say individuates?
Right. Yeah. and there's no and all. I mean, if you just said something like they're just primitively like they just come from the factory that way, or so, like it's like why couldn't there be more? And if it's possible for there to have been a fourth person of the Trinity, and divine persons are necessary beings, then it's necessary that there's four. You know what I mean? So it's like if you just sort of say they're primitively individuated, it's like, well, why aren't there infinitely many persons then? And I don't have any idea. And he never, as far as I know, he's never addressed that. And then if you add on top of that, like he wants to be this hardcore nominalist, so like I would think that what nominalists would say, if you're talking about a cognitive faculty or a power of thinking and willing, you just translate that, well, it's just a way of saying that this soul can make decisions and have thoughts. So what does it mean to have three? I mean, if there's no such thing as powers, it's just kind of a metaphorical way of talking about, this thing can talk and or think and will. Like, what does it mean? It can think and can think three things or will three things. I mean, I can will three different things or two different things. I can have a conflicted will or something, but I don't have two different faculties of willing. So I don't know, it's like, I don't even really know what the model actually is. So I wish that Mohammed Hijab had brought that up at some point, but oh well.
The argument then seems to shift into parts whole situations in regard to the product of three beings with three wills creating the world. What does one of them do that the other two do not? And William and Craig responds with saying, you are misunderstanding causal overdetermination. I could have three matches that light at the same time, and there's not, one match that's doing all the work and the other ones are doing half the work or a third of the work or whatever. That seemed to be a good response, although I don't believe in three wills or three independent beings. But that would still seem to be a response that our Trinitarian model would use as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, William and Craig even at that point said, he actually used the phrase inseparable operations, or the operations, odd, extra, are inseparable. And basically he just said, he rejects like inseparable operations as a general claim, but he's like, I do believe in some inseparable operations. So like, I think creation is an inseparable operation. So, it's, I think it's a weird view to take, but yeah, I think it pretty much responded to Hijab's argument there. I get into that inseparable operations more in the book in response to Bill Hasker, because Hasker believes in the divine processions but doesn't like inseparable operations. So I'm not sure what kind of metaphysics you have to get sometimes inseparable operations. Like, you're muted, I think, or at least for me.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, what are the times that we have it, when one of the times that we don't? Like, what determines the
right? Yeah.
What determines when it's inseparable versus separable? It's odd, but
yeah, and that actually comes up in the thing with Hasker and I. It's like, when would you have them and when would you not? I just argue that causal powers are rooted in an individual, instance of a nature, not the hypostasis,
not the right person.
And that may be kind of hard to see for people at first, but I think you kind of.
Well, and that's ironically the traditional Orthodox and even the Western position in the first 1,000 years. We agree that this is why there's two wills in Christ. There's two natures in Christ. There's two operations, because operations or energies signify the nature from which they proceed. Right. And so that's why there's one will in the Trinity and not three wills in the Trinity.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's the thing. So that, if you just think that causal powers inhere in the nature primarily, then you have to have inseparable operations in the Trinity, and you have to have two natures and two wills and two energies in the incarnation. So yeah, I think it's a weird. I mean, and the other, I mean, your other alternative, it seems like the most straightforward. If you're going to reject that, you would think that you would say, okay, powers just kind of directly attached to a hypostasis then. But in that case, you would always have three actions. I mean, you'd
There
never
wouldn't.
have,
They would always be the same.
yeah. So
there'd be a
I don't know
unanimity
what
there.
kind of metaphysics you have where you kind of sometimes have inseparable operations, but sometimes don't. But I think he might also just kind of misunderstand how inseparable operations are supposed to work. I mean, the causal overdetermination thing, I think, works as a move in the debate for Craig to kind of defend himself, but I don't think that's exactly probably the best way to think about inseparable.
Well, does
operation.
this? I mean, you may not feel this way, but I mean, does this go back to the Apollinarian mistake? Because Apollinarianism is basically taking a feature of a property of nature in human nature, and saying that that's what the subject or the person is. It's identifying the human subject with the rational soul. And so for William Lane Craig to think in his model of what a person is, at least what I've understood him in the past to think a person is, for him, that's just an individual with a body and a soul. There's no notion of a subject that's more than just the properties of the nature. But that would be consistent with the nominalism to have that reductionist model. So maybe the nominalism and the reductionist model and the Apollinarianism are all linked here.
Yeah, that's actually, I think that's probably right. I mean, certainly, it's pretty clear that there's this widespread kind of assumption among a lot of philosophers and maybe evangelical theologians or something, but the cognitive faculties and wills and powers and whatever kind of are hypostatic instead of natural.
Right.
And if that's the view that you take, then yeah, you get three wills in the Trinity and one will in Christ. And they seem to not understand, or they just don't like the idea that the will is natural instead of hypostatic. And I think that's definitely what's going on with Craig. And they'll sort of associate the number of wills and cognitive faculties with like, that's what a person is. Because they think of person as like, what we mean by a person, like a human mind,
like a modern human individual person,
right.
Modern thought,
and they just don't get, or just don't care, that hypostasis is just anything concrete. I mean, I brought this up at one point. The church fathers will give examples of hypostases besides the persons of the Trinity.
Yeah, John Damascus does that in Fount of Knowledge.
Yeah, they'll give like a horse, or like
a hypostasis of a horse,
or a knife, pieces of charcoal, all of those things are hypostases. They're just individual concrete things, and so that's one reason why. Yeah, I mean, I realize there's this big debate, in theology about what are persons? Is it person in the modern sense? But it's like I have no idea how anyone familiar at all with the primary sources could ever think
right
that the church fathers are talking about person in like a Cartesian sense or something. Like, I don't think a gold coin is a person in the modern sense of the term. Like, that's just nuts.
Now, Dr. Khalil, I know he wanted to call in, and he had some comments on the hijab and Craig debate. Dr. Khalil, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on.
Sure.
I was teaching, so I just logged in now. So I don't know what you guys already covered, but just to what you were saying now, this maybe something that's a question for Beau, but also yourself. So I made some comments in a preview video about Craig and hijab. So one thing is, in my view, if Craig is a nominalist, which he is, right?
That's exactly what we were covering.
Yeah.
So then how can he affirm that Christ has a human nature of any kind? There's no such thing as human nature under that view. I don't know how he can ascribe human nature to anything, right? Like for him, I don't see how his incarnate Christ is genuinely human, like in any meaningful sense. And then how can he even talk about homoousios? Like, how can you say the Father and the Son are homoousios if you don't like the three divine persons? They're all bare particulars in Craig's view. Right. They can't, as far as I'm concerned, and I haven't seen anyone make this argument against him. But to me, the three divine persons are bare particulars. They can't share anything. They're basically three gods. So I don't know what you guys think.
Well, I think that's exactly where the critique was going. I'll let Dr. Beau respond, but I mean that's exactly where the critique was going, was that this would lead to tritheism, and that the nominalism would seem to be another big stickler and a big roadblock here.
Yeah, so I think what Craig would do is he would just say, okay, well, when we talk about, so and so has this nature or that nature, like we just have to. He's just going to kind of translate that into this X, Y, and Z are true about this subject. So, like, if this subject has such and such DNA, and he's like this tall and this wide, in ways that like all of that stuff is true, however that works. But anyway, it's true. So if it's just true, if all these predicates are true about you, then the predicate is human is also true about you, right? So it's just going to kind of say, like, for him, a nature, I think, is just kind of a definition, right? So if X, Y, Z predicates are true, then F.
Like when he says the Father is God or the Son is God, it just means the Father is a part of an entity called God. Like, that's it. That's his model.
I think he would want to say, like, X is God means, like, something like X is all powerful and X is omnibenevolent and.
But didn't you just say, you had said a minute ago that when he talks about God possessing attributes or contingent properties, if he's a nominalist, that would be a problem. So,
well,
if you have Craig's view is X is God means X is omnipotent and whatever, that would still imply under nominalism that the Father's omnipotence is still different from the Son's, because like there can't be like truly shared properties, right?
Yeah, I mean, he might just say that's kind of a pseudo question, assuming that there's such a thing as the Father omniscience or whatever, and there really is no such thing. Unanswerable question, but I think it's a problem. I think there's an echo here, but anyway, I do think it's a problem because you do want to say things like there's one nature between the persons of the Trinity, or Christ has two natures. And I guess what he would say to get two natures, he would just say Jesus satisfies all of the predicates that are required to call him human, and then he satisfies all the predicates that are required to call him.
I might have not had the unmute, because I have to unmute if he's talking, and then I have to mute when you're talking. But what Dr. Khalil said was, if you're a nominalist, how could you have a shared attribute between Father and Son as a nominalist? Like, because it seems like there's obviously got to be some kind of metaphysical shared reality there.
Yeah, I think. Well, so two things. One is, and it's kind of confusing because if he's talking about a nature, he's going to be talking about just a nature in a generic sense, like just you satisfy these predicates or whatever. But he goes back and forth, because when he talks about three persons in one being, like we were saying earlier, what really his view amounts to is that there's one hypostasis that has three minds. But he just uses terminology in a weird way. So he calls that one being. So it's sort of like sometimes the ousia is really the hypostasis for him, and kind of everything's kind of gets backwards. So really, if you were going to accuse him of tritheism, I think what he would really do is, I mean, he'd be like, hey, my model says there's one soul. So that's the one, and the one concrete. I mean, really, I think it really boils down to like there's one concrete particular, one bare particular. The real mystery, what Jay and I were talking about just a few minutes before you got on, Khalil, was the big mystery is like what individuates these cognitive faculties if you're a nominalist, right? Because they're not real things. They're just like the fact that you can think, right? Or the fact that you can will. So if there's just this one soul, and if having a will just means it's like true that you can will things, it's not really clear what it could mean to say that there's three wills or three cognitive faculties.
In other words, there's ambiguity about what individuates. But is there any, because I thought earlier when you and I were, me and you, Dr. Beau, you were talking about problems in nominalism for viewing God. Yeah. Is there no element of critique for William Lane Craig's, because to me it seems like it would undercut Christology, it would undercut the Trinity too, if you're a hardcore I didn't realize he was a hardcore nominalist.
Yeah, that's the, I don't think, I mean, so certainly the traditional view about the doctrine of the Trinity absolutely, presupposes some metaphysical machinery, nature, and there's some, you have to be some kind of realist about property, or if not universals, then tropes or something, but you have to have that distinction there. So it's certainly not going to be the orthodox view. And I really don't see how you could actually have a coherent view about the Trinity if you're a nominalist. I mean, maybe someone will come up with something, but it's hard for me to see how.
Now, Dr. Khalil, is there any other? We had progressed in the debate to the point where really they were just getting into
almost to the closing.
What's that?
I was just saying we're almost to their closing statements from what we were.
Yeah, we had gotten up to the point of the closing statements where.
I just want. So, in my opinion, I've studied a lot of the anti-Trinitarian arguments that are on offer in literature from major authors. I thought Hijab's attack was very underwhelming. Like, of all the arguments he could have brought against Craig or the Trinity in general, I found he just picked the weakest ones. And then I actually, a lot of people online, like Muslim sort of cheerleaders, and I understand why they cheerlead. They're like, oh no, like this was so good and blah, blah, blah. But then I actually talked to 3 Muslim philosophers of religion. I'm not going to say who. And I was like, guys, am I the only one who thought this was underwhelming? And they're like, no, it was underwhelming. So what did you think of Hijab's attack arguments?
Well, before you got here, we had basically agreed that there were several places where he could have brought really stronger points. He hit on a couple strong points and then kind of blew past them. So he really didn't. Both sides were kind of underwhelming. Was my assessment.
Yeah, that's exactly what I had thought. And yeah, I agreed. Like I was really excited for it because I was like, there's a million criticisms that I would like to make about William Lane Craig's views on the Trinity, and I was just like, oh, this will be pretty exciting because he's this fantastic debater and he's a really smart guy, but this is like, I think, his weakest subject, and I was really interested to just see like, whoa, how's this gonna go? And yeah, there were so many things I thought so many places Mohammed Hijab could have taken it that he just didn't. So, and one of them was this issue, like, how do you individuate these cognitive faculties? Like, how do you even get those? And he never raised that. He didn't even really, Jay and I were talking about, like, I don't think he really even, I guess a couple times he mentioned tritheism, but like, I would have thought that would have been,
really, if he had hammered William Lane Craig on tritheism, that would have been really hardcore.
But yeah, I thought there was a lot of stuff he could have said that he didn't. And also, one thing Khalil, before you got on here, I was saying to Jay was like, I just felt like in a lot of the arguments that Mohammed Hijab did give, like he never really fully articulated like where he's trying to go with that argument. Like he spent a whole bunch of time talking about how Craig is a heretic and his view's not really mainstream, but it's like, okay, but tell me how that's pertinent. Like just, make it explicit. Like, what do why is that showing that the doctrine of the Trinity is incoherent? And he didn't really kind of connect the dots on a lot of his arguments.
Any thoughts on
thoughts
on the closing statement or anything else that comes to mind?
Did Khalil already get off? Or
are you still there? Did you want to talk, Dr. Khalil?
Maybe not. Maybe he's gone.
The sort of odd positions that Craig has, that doesn't contribute towards the thesis that the Trinity is incoherent. It doesn't. However, I'll tell you why he did it. So he did it as a showman. He did that. He started with that. Again, I don't think it's a smart thing, but like he did it for showmanship because he wanted to get the audience on his side.
Right.
He wanted all of you guys watching to be like, wow, like why we should support this guy. And then what he wanted is some clippable moments.
Yeah, that's what we said. That's what we said, exactly.
Jake clipped it up. He clipped it up.
Right.
So this is just this. I mean, they do this to everybody. They try to do it to you. They try to do it to everyone. They don't usually succeed when they do it. But that's all it was. But I do think I would be interested personally. I have not actually seen a good debate between a Muslim and a Christian where there's like a proper sort of more traditional Trinity on offer. And they actually get into the metaphysics of this stuff. I have not seen a debate. Usually they're just arguing about scriptures or this, that, and the other.
Yeah. Which that's another thing. Like I was hoping that this would get into that because, you would expect that it could have.
Now, anything on the closing statements? We've come up to that point there. Overall, everybody seems to be on the same page. It was a pretty underwhelming discussion. It's kind of short.
Yeah.
It was a little too short. It was only 1 hour, but
yeah.
Final thoughts on the debate?
So yeah, at the very end, Craig, I guess he did go full preacher mode at the end. It
was like an altar call at the end there.
Just, what Mohammed Hijab kind of criticized him for, but. And at first, I was kind of like, dude, this, I don't know. I was a little bit like, come on, like give a real closing statement. I was kind of like, well, okay, whatever. That's what he's going to do. But then I thought about it and I was like, actually, I kind of respect William Lane Craig for doing that. Like, you know what I mean? Like he's a philosopher, but everything he's done, he kind of sees as like a ministry and whatever. And I was like, that's actually kind of cool. And then I thought about it and I was like, I sort of felt like Mohammed Hijab actually was sort of in preacher mode through the entire thing. You know what I mean? Like, because a lot of it was him just like being really boisterous and like, I will show you, this is incoherent.
Yeah, right.
Irrefutable evidence, blah, blah, blah. And he was sort of being like Southern Baptist preacher / Islamic imam, like the whole way through. And I was like, why are you criticizing him for? I don't know. I was just found it a little off-putting, but and Hijab's like last, his final statement was just, just not. He just said a bunch of stuff that was just not the case. Like Craig has retreated from the debate. Talking about the resurrection and blah 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 is not relevant. We've both dismantled Aquinas together, and blah blah blah. And it, all that stuff is like, they didn't dismantle anything. They just agreed not to talk about it because they just kind of agreed that they didn't think that was true. It would sort of be like if I debated a Protestant or something, and we were like, well, let's just agree at the outset that Islam is false, and then we'll go on and have our little Christian debate or something. And it's like, well, we just demolished Islam. Like, no, you didn't. You just agreed to talk about it because you both reject. That's it's just so ridiculous. But, they didn't really establish anything. And then he ended with another one of these, like the Trinity is complicated things, and that's yeah, that just drives me nuts. So like earlier I was saying, I don't know if Khalil's still on, but anyway, to you, Jay, I was saying like, that's this thing I teach people in critical thinking classes, like just because something seems simple and intuitive and obvious, like doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be true.
Right.
The other thing that I really dislike about that, actually, if Khalil is on, maybe he can respond to this, because I think that is a horrible long-term strategy for Muslim apologists, because what it comes across as, these guys saying, you should be Muslim because it's easier to be dumb if you're Muslim.
That's what I think that equates to.
Which is not a good look for Islam, number one. And number two, like in the long run, because I've said this about, I shouldn't say, but I've said this about Protestantism for a long, like evangelical kind of fundamentalist Protestantism for a long time, is like it's a problem if you have some approach that leads to brain drain. And what happens is, like, if you've got this approach, like, here, I'm going to attack the Trinity with arguments that are not that great. And so smart people are going to look at it and be like, nah, right? And dumb people are going to look at it and be like, oh man, this guy seems really confident and whatever, right? So like the approach they're taking does nothing to attract or retain intelligent people.
Yeah.
And it only functions to retain and maybe attract dumb people, basically.
Yeah.
And what that means is, like, over time, you're going to have brain drain. Like, all the smart people are going to go somewhere else. All the dumb people come into your camp, and then it's just like this. That just feeds into it. So then your next generation of apologists are all morons. You're going to do the same thing unwittingly, right? Like, and it's just a really bad approach.
Dr. Khalil, anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, but come on, Beau. Islam is so simple. There's only one God, and you guys have hypostasis and usia and all this stuff. How is a common man on the street supposed to worship a usia?
You're right. Sign me up, Khalil.
Yeah, just sign up. Just sign up here. Give me your email address. Please make a donation to Sapiens Institute.
Yeah.
Well, the Mormons say that if I pray, I'll feel a burning bosom and burning in my bosom. So that seems pretty simple to me. So I guess Mormonism is true. But thank you for that. We got some super chats. If anybody wants to ask, so Dr. Beau will have to go soon. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Khalil. You're welcome to stay if you want. If anybody wants to call in and ask a couple of questions, you can. We have a few minutes. I don't want to stop Dr. Beau from any other comments on the debate if he wants to say anything.
The only last thing
is
another thing that I found kind of just obnoxious was after the closing statements, Cameron Bertuzzi was like, let's end with, I want to end by, why don't you say one thing that you like about the other person's view, And like Craig was genuine about it. He's like, I like monotheism and the denial of divine simplicity that you had, like there's lots of stuff about Islam that, Christians agree with and we can like. And so he was kind of a genuine, response. And then Mohammed Hijab just like took it as an opportunity to like take another dig. It was just kind of like, well, he's like, I like William Lane Craig personally. And then he's just like, I like his bravery in denying the eternal generation. And, like, it's kind of like, dude, come on. Like, just say something nice. That was the point of the thing. But anyway, just kind of was.
I'm just curious, who's the first Christian to deny the generation of the Son?
As far as I know, it is Herman Alexander's role in 1689, which actually...
You're cutting out, Dr. Beau. Could you say that again?
Oh, sorry. So Mohammed Hijab actually mentioned in the debate Herman Alexander role in 1689, who, as far as I know, that is the first person to like explicitly reject it. And I'm pretty sure that he got that from Jake, and Jake got that from me. Because I don't know anyone else who, has made much out of that. But...
So are you saying...
See, I could...
He said, "Are you saying that you prepared Mohammed Hijab for this debate?"
Yeah, yeah. I, I mean, I guess indirectly by just saying stuff and Jake sort of copies and pastes. Indirectly, I did help it.
Lily Sakura says for $3, how would you respond to the powerful Quranic argument against the Trinity that Jesus and Mary ate food? Don't you see the signs are clear? Well, yeah, that's a joke. Super chat. I think that's a bad argument. Anonymous, $10. God bless the One Holy Catholic Orthodox Church. Thank you for your content. And thank you for no compromise on orthodoxy. Emilion Ascentic, $10. Thank you, Jay and Dr. Beau, for this theological discussion and guidance. Emilion again for $10. Can you politely ask Dr. Beau, when are you going to create a YouTube channel and allow us to follow your work?
Well, you can follow my work. I have I think I have everything that I've published except for this book on my website. And most or all of my YouTube appearances and stuff on it. I mean, I've thought about doing some kind of YouTube like interview kind of series or something, but I would almost have to have someone else who would manage all the technical stuff because it's
yeah, it's its own. It's a hassle. It's its own job for sure. Anonymous, $5. Holy orthodoxy is true. Thank you, Anonymous. Anybody else want to call in or any other comments, Dr. Khalil? Anything else? I don't see anybody who wants to. If you want to request to speak, just hit the request to speak button, and I'll bring you up. Nobody else? All right. Well, we will look for that book when it's out. Dr. Beau, appreciate you coming back on, and thank you for doing the debate review. Yeah, let's when the book comes out, come back, and we'll hear somebody who wants to ask a question. So let's see what MKG has a question. Go ahead, man.
Yes, hi. Thanks for bringing me up last second.
Yeah.
I had a question regarding the last thing you guys touched on regarding the fact that Islam's claim of simplicity and Trinity being complex, and you guys saying that it attracts dumb people and all that. I think that's still an important issue of the average person. I know Khalil kind of threw it as like a throwaway comment, but the fact that Islam attracts common people with that phrase, people like Sneeko and stuff like that, I'm wondering what you think the best, because I do agree from like the smart people perspective, that's where it kind of falls short, but from the average side of like, if we were to see kiosks of religion, basically Christianity and Islam, and then the common man would go and ask each person why this is a good thing or why this is the religion of truth. Basically, the one phrase that each one would use like at their thesis statement. I think Islam's case to the common person might be more appealing. I'm just wondering, even though I agree with the monarchical Trinity, I'm wondering what you think the counter would be from an Orthodox Christian perspective.
What would you say to somebody who says, well, why wouldn't we think that, it's true because, it's simple? How do you convey that to somebody who's sort of the common man or whatever?
Yeah, no, I think
the final, the conclusion point of like,
go ahead.
Why would God make the religion for all people complicated? I think that's something a Muslim would say.
Yeah, well, I mean, to that, I would just say it's not like God is making. I mean, it's not like a religion is something God just like makes up, right? It's whatever's actually true. So it's not like God could just sort of decide, well, I'm going to make reality, different or something like that. But I do think that you raise an interesting point, because this is something that I realized when I was doing my dissertation and going through Gregory of Nyssa's letter to Ablabius and realizing like the way people have had such a hard time kind of reading and interpreting that text, because they didn't realize that the way Gregory of Nyssa himself is thinking about it is he's thinking, who are the different audiences that we are talking to, and how do we give a response to each of these audiences that will satisfy each one? And he gives this first argument or this response where he says, well, if you're talking to simple-minded people who are just kind of straightforward and you're just speaking offhand or whatever, he says, I would just say, well, our religion is, it's not like polytheistic like the pagan Greeks, but it's not this like Unitarian view like the Jews, and we have this like middle way between the two. And then he just immediately is like, of course, that doesn't really answer the question. Like, that doesn't solve anything. And so people have looked at that and like, well, why does he even say that? What's he doing? And what I realize is what he really is thinking is he's actually got three audiences in mind, and he's really giving a response to a bishop, and he's thinking like, well, in a pastoral sort of way, what do we say? And so he does acknowledge like, yeah, you've got to have a response for the common man. It's just that the response for the common man needs to be something simple, and it might not really fully really solve the issue, but
we lost him for a second. He'll be back. Just 1 second. We lost you for a second.
But I do think it's a good.
We lost you for a second there. You were saying the last thing you said was about the common man, and then you do need to give this response. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, yeah, just that Gregory's thinking you do need to kind of think pastorally, and so have a response for the common man and have responses for educated people. So I do think it's important. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's a good point. Like, I guess rhetorically, you do want to have, good.
Well, but I think every religious position kind of has this issue. Any major world religion, you're gonna have people saying, well, look, it's really simple. Our position's true. And then any of the ones that you get into, even Islam, you're going to find out, well, there's a lot more complexity here than was maybe on the surface. So, there's not really any like silver bullet way to avoid the possibility of, thinking that the system is on the surface just really simple and scaled down. Then you get into it, you find out there's a lot more complexity involved, and that's going to be true for any position.
I think
speaking as a Muslim, I will say Islam is complex. Islam is not simplistic. Throughout Islamic civilization, both Sunnis and Shia have always distinguished between the common people, known as the awam, and the intellectual elite, known as the khas. So, this is a very common distinction. So, there has always been an internally complex Islamic discourse that is for the elite, that they don't actually share with the common people. Like, they purposely don't do it. There are very specific protocols in every religious science of Islam. And if you read their writings, they're always distinguishing between the commoners and the elite. And they're like, oh, we're writing for the elite. So it's really false advertising when people come and say, oh, Islam is so simple. I mean, it's really not. Historically, it's not. Islam, like Christianity, is a combination of scripture, tradition, and interpretation. Like those three things. There's not one Islamic sect or denomination that is free of scripture, tradition, and interpretation. Islamic law is one of the most complicated things ever. It's very complicated, right? Islamic theology is even you could say it's more esoteric than Islamic law. And the thing is, to be a Muslim, even whether Shia or Sunni, you are required, before you understand how the way to live, you are required to affirm an Islamic creed, a set of beliefs, and you're required to understand what you affirm. Just like you guys have a Nicene creed and these creeds, I assume a Christian has to know the creed that they affirm, right? They can't just affirm it blindly. So a Muslim has to affirm a creed out of conviction, and you cannot affirm a creed if you haven't studied some degree of Islamic theology. And guess what? That's full of terms like substance and accident and necessary and contingent. So this is just a mirage that, Islam is simple and, all the other religions are complicated. Actually, as a religion professor, I'll say all religions have varying degrees of complexity. Yes, exactly. There is a simplistic version of Christianity. God became man, so man might become God. There. Very simple. That will appeal. Some level of Christians, that will satisfy them. And some level of Muslims, the Shahada alone will satisfy them. They won't go deeper, and that's fine. That's the beauty of religion, that all religions contain layers of complexity and simplicity, and every human can sort of engage with the level of depth in their religion that they have the capacity to bear. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'll say this too. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I mean, I've always been interested in just religion in general. I like to study ancient mythologies, and I like to learn about Buddhism and Hinduism, all this stuff. And the way that Islam was always presented to me, I always felt like this is the most boring religion that I don't really I'm not really that interested in. It just seemed so because it always was presented when I was a kid, or just reading about stuff on my own. It's just well, it's just this book, and there's a few rules and whatever, and there you go. That's it. And I was just that's it. This is, and it's only in the last several years that I've kind of, really, well, I mean, I guess when I went to grad school, I kind of started to learn something about Islamic philosophy, and I was oh, that's interesting. They actually have this whole, history of philosophical debate and whatever. And it's oh, there's actually a whole, yeah, I mean, to me, that makes it much more interesting. Now I kind of am oh, I'd like to know more about all of this. So I think, yeah, it's not a good way to present.
Yeah, the attempted selling point of, oh, this is the super easy thing. It might cut both ways.
Yeah.
Jordan, go ahead.
But it's going to turn off some people.
Yeah, exactly. Jordan, do you have a question?
It's pretty much on the topic that you've had this whole week about atheism factories and what Dr. Khalil just said. Why, even though over the last 50 years, every church, Protestant church in mainstream, dumbed down Islam, why is it continued? Why is this process continued of abandoning any higher intellect within religion? Why is it persistent, even though in the long term it always ends in liberalism and atheism? Why is it persistent, do you guys think?
I think there's multiple reasons. I think there's a cultural trend. It's really loud in the background, so let me. So I think there's a cultural trend in general of people leaving theism, leaving the church, leaving Christianity, because the culture is so toxic. So it's constantly pumped at them to engage in degeneracy, to accept degeneracy. The education system, the government from a top down is pushing it. There are wealthy people who influence religions, and they donate to religious institutions, to seminaries, to make them into atheism factories. So all of those things play a role. That's my take on that. Why do you think there's a constant push, Dr. Branson?
I mean, I'd agree with all that, but I'd also say, to me, I think there's this kind of business model for churches that, I mean, especially in America, it's become a thing at some point to kind of treat it like a business, you're thinking about marketing and getting, your people are customers that are going to come in. And I mean, if you want to be marketable to the widest audience, you want to be
lowest common denominator.
Well, yeah, I mean, really, I mean, how could you get a huge mega church, if you're taking really specific views on a lot of issues and whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you're anti-Skittles, anti this and that, that's going to cut down on the offering plate. So, exactly, there might be it might hurt the bottom line. So, business church, which I did a live stream making fun of business church a few years ago. So a lot of you have probably seen that. I don't see any more super chats. Dr. Beau, thank you for joining me. Dr. Khalil, thank you for joining me as well. Any final thoughts? Anything else? The debate. What have you thought of the recent Muslim debates? I don't know if you've seen the other ones, the ones that we did with Daniel and Muslim Lantern.
No, I heard about that, and I just now watched the first, I don't know, maybe half hour or something, but it was a pretty long one, so I've got to go through more. But I did, notice the opening, this is simple, and
And again, I want to remind people, Mohammed Hijab as well. Sam and I, Fresh and Fits agreed. We're happy to do 2-on-2. So Mohammed Hijab doesn't want to debate Sam Shamoon directly. He wants Sam to debate Jake. Easy solution. Jake and Mohammed Hijab debate me and Sam on Fresh and Fit. Myron said he's happy to do that. So I'll issue that challenge. And thank you for joining me, Dr. Beau. And everybody can check out his website. He's linked. If you want to go see his lectures and his media appearances, I highly recommend this series on monarchical Trinitarianism. That's over at his website. You can also find his uploaded videos at Orthodox Shahada. Dr. Khalil is also on YouTube as well under his name. So thank you guys, and appreciate you coming on.